Well, welcome everybody. My name is Keta Howitt Felix. I am the digital educator at the National Museum of the United States Army. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for our panel discussion that the nation might live, Lincoln and the Civil War. We are joined tonight by three different Lincoln historic sites. We have the Lincoln Home National Historic Site, President Lincoln's Cottage, and Ford's Theater, and we are very excited to hear from them about their sites and about how they interpret Lincoln's legacy. So tonight we have Timothy Good. Timothy S. Good is a 33-year-old National Park Service veteran and is currently the superintendent at the Lincoln Home National Historic Site. Good has served at over a dozen assignments from Maine to western Nebraska and from the Great Lakes to Louisiana. Good received a Bachelor of Arts from Valparaiso University, Master of Arts from the University of Durham, England, and he earned a diploma from the United States Naval War College, in addition to authoring/editing 6 published books. So welcome, Timothy. And Alex Wood is the Education Programs Manager at Ford's Theater, where she facilitates museum programs for students and lifelong learners, historic site visits, summer professional development programs for teachers, and distance learning initiatives. She is particularly interested in historiography and exploring Ford's as a place of public memory. And last, we have Michael Atwood Mason. Michael Atwood Mason joined President Lincoln's Cottage as the CEO and executive director in September 2021. Previously, he served as director of the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, where he led the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, Smithsonian Folkways recordings, the archives, and educational and cultural programs. Dr. Mason has a PhD in folklore and began his career at the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum as a researcher and exhibit developer. Later, he spent 20 years at the Museum of Natural History, where he ended his tenure as director of exhibitions. So welcome to Tim, Alex, and Michael. We're very glad to have you guys here tonight. We're very excited to see you all here. We'll just jump right into our questions for the panelists here. What's really interesting about this group that we have here tonight is that each of you deal with President Lincoln at a different point in his presidency. We have before the presidency, during, and then right at the very end of his life. And so for someone who hasn't been to your site before, can you introduce your site and talk about how your site interprets Lincoln's legacy? And I guess we'll start at the earlier point of his life. We'll start with Tim there.
Kenna, thanks so much for reaching out, having as part of the program. Thanks to the National Museum of the United States Army. It's a great idea. Yeah, if I look out my window right here, I can see Lincoln's home, where he lived for 17 years. And we describe his time here. We heavily focus on his role as a family person and a husband and a father. But we also try to set the stage for later on in his life, discussing the anti-slavery principles that he held to here, which eventually lead to some what we might describe as abolitionist actions while he's president of the United States.
And so what do you see as his legacy? What is the importance of having this site and remembering this site?
I think it's critical to understand Lincoln at the time that he's living here. And the best way I found to introduce that is to talk about Stephen Douglas. When you talk about Stephen Douglas, you suddenly see Lincoln in a much different light. Now, some of you may know there used to be a statue of Stephen Douglas in front of the Illinois State Capitol. That has since been removed in the past 2 years because they started to look at many of the statements he made during the Lincoln Douglas debates, and they were unquestionably statements of white supremacy, which was different to what Lincoln was saying when he was describing all men are created equal. And so you see the differences between Lincoln and Douglas in 1858 when he's living in his house. You can see how those differences erupt in the Civil War where Lincoln was president.
Thank you, Tim. So we'll move on to Michael. Michael, can you tell us a little bit about your site and how the Cottage interprets Lincoln's legacy?
Just to say thank you to you for inviting the Cottage to participate in this exciting conversation. President Lincoln's Cottage is 4 miles from the White House, and it is the place where Lincoln and his family spent a quarter of his presidency. It began as a place where he and Mary sought solace after their son died, and it became a place where he did a huge amount of consultation and sort of deep work around emancipation, meeting with people, talking to people, pacing the floors at night. And from our point of view, we also play up his role as a family man. We tell stories about both Tad and Mary Lincoln, as well as other people who worked in the house. So we're really trying to create a well-rounded picture of Lincoln as a person with foibles, who's straining under the pressure of the presidency and the war, and also to really paint a picture of his evolving thinking about racial equity in the United States. So from our point of view, the legacy is really a person who started with nothing and through lots of effort blossomed into this transformational leader, precisely because he was reflecting, he was engaged with other people in conversation, and he was not afraid to take action about the defining issue of his time.
Thank you, Michael. And for full disclosure, I started my early career at Lincoln's Cottage. It has a special place in my heart. So I'm very excited that Michael's here to talk about the Cottage today, because it really is an amazing place. Unfortunately, Michael and I never crossed paths there, but we're glad to have him here tonight. Finally, we have Alex. Can you tell us about your site and about how you all interpret Lincoln?
So Ford's Theater is the place where President Lincoln was assassinated. And the theater and the Peterson House, located directly across the street where Lincoln actually died, are National Park Service properties. And I work for Ford's Theater Society, which is the private nonprofit partner. And so together we keep this building alive and the stories within it flowing. So Ford's, for Lincoln, was a place of joy and a place of respite, and then ultimately a place of tragedy. And so we tell the story of his assassination, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how it could come to pass and setting the stage for what it was like to be in downtown Washington during the Civil War, and then sort of what puzzle pieces needed to be in place in order for something like the assassination to happen at Ford's Theater when it did. And today we're also a working theater, so continuing to embrace those multiple facets of Abraham Lincoln's legacy. So his joy of the theater, how much he loved going to the theater, how much he enjoyed spending time at Ford's in particular. And so we're both this historic site and a working theater, and we try to find as many intersections of those two sort of sides of our brain, our left and right brain. We try to bring them together as often as possible.
So one thing about Lincoln is he holds kind of a special part in American history. He's very loved by pretty much everybody. Most people point to him as one of their favorite presidents. And so because of that, he's often deified or put up on a pedestal. And as Tim pointed out to me in one of our discussions earlier, there's literally a temple to President Lincoln on the National Mall. And so with this, how does your site recognize Lincoln's humanity? Alex, can I start with you on that one? I mean, you have a very interesting side of Lincoln. That's where he died. So if you could jump into that.
Yeah, so there's nothing more human than our mortality, right? So yeah, Abraham Lincoln's assassination really sort of crystallized his sort of the trajectory of his legacy in a lot of ways, right? And so the fact that he was assassinated at the moment that he was, right, when the city was celebrating Union victory finally after Robert E. Lee's surrender, and and the 13th Amendment was like within grasp. It had been passed by Congress and yet to be ratified by the states, but all of this work toward emancipation and the abolition of slavery was like finally coming true, and the war was finally over. And then Lincoln is taken out of the equation, right? He's killed horrifically in a theater in front of, over 1,000 witnesses. And in a lot of ways, he's sort of immediately martyred, right? There's these extraordinary images of, sort of the apotheosis of Lincoln, and you have George Washington in the heavens, surrounded by angels, and he's welcoming Abraham Lincoln into heaven. And then you have the sort of calendar coincidence that April 14th, 1865 was also Good Friday, which is a significant day in the Christian tradition. And that Sunday was Easter Sunday. So everyone who was going to church on Sunday showed up and got a sermon about not just Easter, but also Abraham Lincoln. And so this sort of extraordinary linking of the secular and the sacred all at once, all in this one person. But, you know, while we can see Lincoln as a martyr and we sort of put him up on this pedestal and he can be kind of deified, right? We always want to bring it back down to earth and bring it back down to his humanity.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've seen some of those images of him up in heaven, and they're fascinating to see. Tim, can you actually talk about his earlier life and how you deal with that at your house?
But when we talk about Lincoln's humanity in Springfield, the two things we focus on, first of all, the death of Eddie. You know, before the age of 4, he passes away. It was very traumatic for both his parents. And it's a good way for people to understand the Lincolns who start riding above the storm, who live in daily lives suffering like this. And of course, as we well know, other of his children will also pass away in the future. The second way we talk about it is also the concept of Lincoln's political career. He loses the election in 1856 and 1858. And so he doesn't go through every election undefeated, and he suffers those two defeats. And after 1858, he even considers giving up politics altogether.
So, Michael, how about your site? Can you touch on that as well?
Sure. At President Lincoln's Cottage, we really we fill the space with stories about what the Lincoln family did in the 4 years that they were there, and that includes telling a story of President Lincoln losing his temper at an unexpected visitor and then apologizing the following day. It includes stories about climbing, arriving home from the White House with Secretary Seward and climbing the tree to bring peacocks down who'd gotten stuck up in a tree. So this kind of switching from president, commander-in-chief to dad is something that we spend a lot of time dealing with. But because Lincoln was so unassuming, it's really very easy. I mean, we also tell a story of George Burritt coming to visit him, an English travel writer. And, Lincoln appears, Burritt tells the story of Lincoln appearing in his bathrobe and his carpet slippers, so it's really easy for us to humanize him because he is so tremendously human. We also were blessed with a huge number of sources, as most people are, around Lincoln. So, we have all these details about where he and Tad played checkers and what he ate for breakfast, coffee and a boiled egg. And so it's very easy for us to paint a picture for visitors of this rather remarkable man in very everyday circumstances. And the juxtaposition of that and the kind of transformational decisions that he was making is really powerful for visitors.
Yeah, I always love hearing about the fallibility of people, the humanity of people, especially those who do loom so big in the history books. So it's really interesting that all three of your sites are able to touch on that fact as well. Now, this is a program with the National Army Museum, and so because of that, we do have to talk about the military. I think one of the sites with the most direct connection to the military is probably Lincoln's Cottage. I mean, he did have soldiers literally living on the grounds of the cottage to protect him. So, Michael, can you talk about his relationship with the soldiers around him and why he saw that relationship as being so important to him?
Well, so sure. I mean, the what I find so interesting is it really just reinforces who Lincoln was, a person who was deeply empathetic and deeply interested in the people around him, despite his famous melancholy and solitude. Everywhere he went, he talked to people and engaged them in really meaningful ways. So there are lots of accounts from soldiers about him walking among their camp and saying good morning. There's a famous story that we often tell of a corporal who was on sentry duty walking past the cottage, and Tad and Lincoln were on the veranda playing checkers. And this corporal wrote home and said, the president asked me to come up and play, and I couldn't beat him. As hard as I tried, I couldn't beat him. So we know that Lincoln was engaged with those folks. We know that he stopped at the Mount Pleasant Hospital, for which my neighborhood is named here in Washington, D.C. We know that he was sometimes impatient with his guards. He was often they would come to pick him up, and he would already have left for the White House. The other thing that I guess I want to underscore is that the cottage is located on what is now called the Armed Forces Retirement Homes grounds. And that institution existed when Lincoln was there. And there were veterans, most of them disabled veterans, living next to him. And he also interacted regularly with them. The reason I think that matters is because he was really aware of how terrible war was and the impacts that it had on people who were at war. And it's very clear that he's balancing this need to save the Union and working towards abolishing slavery with the real human cost of the war. And so it gives some sense of the kinds of relationships he had, I hope.
Yeah, that's great. Similarly, at Ford's Theater, Lincoln was accompanied by a soldier who was there with him when he was shot. Tomorrow, we do have a whole talk about the Lincoln conspiracy and the Army's response and the aftermath of the assassination. But to prepare us for that discussion tomorrow, Alex, can you tell us a little bit about the assassination and the response to that?
Yes. So Major Henry Rathbone was one of the Lincoln's guests at the theater that night, and he was there with his fiancée, Clara Harris. They were not the Lincolns' first choice guests. The Lincolns actually struggled to find folks who were available to go to the theater with them that night. But so when, John Wilkes Booth entered the box and fired the fatal shot, Major Rathbone was the first person to respond, and he leapt up and he tried to stop John Wilkes Booth, and John Wilkes Booth actually stabbed him horrifically in the arm. And then Major Rathbone tried to keep John Wilkes Booth from getting away, but John Wilkes Booth leaps out onto the stage and he's waving this bloody knife around with Rathbone's blood, and yells at the audience, and then he runs off into the night. And Rathbone was finally tended to by a doctor much later that evening, I think across the street in the Peterson boarding house. He even passed out in the hallway over there. But this event really traumatized him. He was haunted by it for the rest of his life, which ended actually quite tragically, as he sort of never really recovered from the guilt and the trauma of not being able to save President Lincoln. But there's actually a really interesting military connection with Ford's Theater, the place, that I'd love to share. And that's actually, so after the assassination, when the government seized the building because it was a crime scene, and the Fords couldn't return it to being a theater because the people of Washington didn't want it to go back to being a theater, right? People weren't ready to return to this place of horrific tragedy and violence and just see a comedy as if nothing had happened there anymore. And so Secretary of War Edwin Stanton went to Congress, and he got the government to purchase the building. And he made this argument that the building should be put to use immediately in memorial of Abraham Lincoln by being a place that would process the pension record applications for Union veterans. And so the theater was gutted. It was turned into an office building, and the War Department operated like archival offices out of Ford's Theater, where they kept the medical records that were required to approve pension applications for Union veterans.
It's just an early version of the Army Museum. We'll go with that. So Timothy, how about you? Is there an Army connection at the Lincoln home?
One of the fascinating things about Lincoln, he's considered one of the best presidential leaders during wartime, yet he had basically zero military experience prior to being president. And so that does raise the question, how was he so effective as president without having this former experience? And I think one of Lincoln's skills is knowing where he had the experience to lead and where he did not. And as president, he's continuously looking for that leader that will provide the military experience and effectiveness that he needs. And he eventually finds that in March of 1864 with Ulysses S. Grant.
So if I can just add something that I recently learned, David Kent points out in his new book that Lincoln is constantly learning, right? He's constantly gathering new information, and he gets to Washington as president. He knows that there's a war coming, and he goes to the Library of Congress and checks out 2 classic books about military strategy, and he holds on to them until Grant steps up. And then he returns them to the Library of Congress. Like, okay, I'm good now. I have the right advisor, and I don't need this help anymore. I have a person I can talk to and learn what I need to learn.
Yeah, not just like I mean, that's an outstanding point, Michael. And the other aspect to think about Lincoln is he's willing to admit when he's wrong. I mean, look how many generals he goes through in the Army of the Potomac. I mean, imagine a president today going through 6 Joint Chiefs of Staff during his presidency. I mean, would they be able to survive that? But Lincoln admits he's wrong, he moves on and keeps trying someone, as Michael said, until he gets up to Ulysses S. Grant.
The Emancipation Proclamation, I want to turn to that because it is one of the most defining decisions of Lincoln's presidency. It will be touched on tomorrow in a couple of our talks. But how does your site interpret the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's evolving views on slavery, and his desire to end the war? Michael, can we start with you? Because your site really has a very close connection with the Emancipation Proclamation.
Sure. Our visitors really, I mean, the kind of getting to the Emancipation Proclamation and the room where it was drafted is kind of key to our visitor experience. And we spend a lot of time talking about the competing notions of freedom that existed, different sets of values that were alive and well in the United States at the time of the Civil War. So by the time visitors get there, they're kind of warmed up, right? I mean, we talk about the fact that there were 2 freed African Americans and an Irish American immigrant who worked in the Cottage, and we talk about Lincoln's really explicitly racist statements at various moments, particularly in the Douglas debates. And then we really try and paint a picture of Lincoln's evolving thinking. Right. I mean, he to your point, Tim, most presidents would not be able to change their mind as kind of consistently about how to solve a major social problem the way Lincoln did with the problem of slavery in America. And so for us, we are really trying to connect people to their own humanity through the stories of Lincoln and his family's humanity, and then encourage them to kind of imagine how they can contribute to making meaningful social change the way Lincoln made meaningful social change with the Emancipation Proclamation.
That was always my favorite thing when I would talk about the Emancipation Proclamation with young kids and ask them what would they do to make the world a better place. It really is a fun discussion to have. But Alex, Tim, if either of you want to jump in and talk about the Emancipation or even just Lincoln's views on slavery and the war, love to hear how you guys interpret that.
Yeah, well, we also talk a lot about Lincoln's growth and his evolving views and his sort of evolving public stance on slavery, right? Because we also have evidence that he personally always knew slavery was wrong, but it's his public opinion and his public actions that really changed over time. And what's interesting about the Emancipation Proclamation is it fits sort of right in the middle of this sort of momentum that, you know, ultimately leads to Lincoln's death, right? In that he is taking these steps to promise freedom. And then if that promise of freedom is fulfilled, what is freedom actually going to look like? And on April 11th, 1865, President Lincoln, in what would become his last speech, says that he believes that some African-American men had earned the right to vote, right? And those men in particular were those who had volunteered to fight for the Union Army. And those men were able to fight for the Union Army shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation was declared. So it's this sort of snowball effect, and it's just this increasing momentum towards the end, where finally, in April of 1865, Lincoln is imagining what freedom could look like for 4 million newly freed people in this country. And it's a step towards citizenship, right? It's the franchise. It's being part of this government that is of the people and by the people and for the people. And that's the thing that tipped John Wilkes Booth over the edge, right? And so we always talk about the Emancipation Proclamation and how significant a step it was in the process towards freedom, but then tie it into sort of setting the stage to what ultimately led to the tragedy of the assassination.
And if I could just put in a shameless plug for Alex and for President Lincoln's Cottage. Today we dropped an episode of Q&A, our podcast, where Alex goes into a lot more depth about this. It's a very good listen. Available on all your favorite podcast platforms.
Yeah, Ken, I'll follow up. In Lincoln Home, we try to frame the Emancipation Proclamation between the debates and the Gettysburg Address, and looking at the Gettysburg Address as the final debate, because there was no topic that Lincoln and Douglas disagreed with more than the interpretation of the Declaration of Independence and all men are created equal. And so you notice Lincoln providing the final word on this. Douglas has already passed away. Notice Lincoln doesn't start the speech out saying in 1776. He says 77 years ago. And that's intentional because he knows if he starts out with 1776, half his audience is going to be turned off because they know exactly what he's talking about. But most people aren't going to do, 20 times 4 is 80, 80 plus 7, and then they're going to do the math. And they just listen to the argument, and he's giving the final rebuttal in terms of that this nation was founded on that principle, not the principle of white supremacy, as Douglas argued in 1858.
I love that point. I think that's really interesting. But jumping off of our discussion here about emancipation, a lot of people ask the question of what if. We all love to look back in history and say, what if? What if Lincoln hadn't died when he did? What if he was able to actually live to see everything that he had worked for come to fruition? So with that, how do you think Reconstruction might have been different if Lincoln lived? And what was his vision of Reconstruction? Alex, can I start with you on this one?
Sure. with my Lincoln speeches at the ready here. So we can look at Lincoln's words in his second inaugural address, which is where he sort of puts out maybe the most poetic vision of what Reconstruction might look like. And we always know the conclusion, right? With malice toward none and charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, we need to finish the work we are in, bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, there's your soldiers again, and for his widow and his orphan, and to achieve a just and lasting peace among ourselves and all nations, right? So it's this beautiful message of healing and coming together and caring for one another. But before he gets to that, the bulk of the speech is really laying it out on the table that the war was about slavery and that everybody knows it, and that the human cost of the war, and Michael, you addressed this earlier, right? The just sheer numbers of lives lost and destroyed and forever changed, that perhaps that is divine punishment for this sin of slavery, right? If every drop of blood drawn by the lash should be paid by another drawn by the sword. I mean, this is really intense language. And so if we sort of look at that and juxtapose it, you know, the second paragraph of the speech with the last paragraph of the speech, it wasn't going to be all sunshine and rainbows in Reconstruction, even under Lincoln, right? And then this April 11th speech, which becomes his last speech, is actually super nitty gritty. That's talking very logistically about like how to sort of get people back into the civic process and how to get the states that had considered themselves in rebellion, you know, the so-called Confederacy, how could they be sort of reintegrated into the United States in Union life? And so this is why he's talking about voting rights, because he's talking about, okay, so in order to participate in the democracy, people need to vote. And so who's going to be voting? And so in this rather nitty-gritty speech, he just sort of slips in that really important sentence about African-American suffrage. But you know, people heard it and they knew what it meant. But it's interesting to think about, you know, Lincoln's sort of deliberate pacing. I'll say, you know, he was accused of being slow. He knew that people who wanted to be more active, acting faster, making change come more quickly. He knew that they were frustrated with him for tarrying. But, you know, he always sort of said, but I commit to a path and it might take me a while to get to the end, but I'm going to get there. And so perhaps that would have been his tactic in Reconstruction too, slow and steady. I don't know.
Well, Tim and I had a very interesting discussion about Reconstruction, so I'd love to hear Tim's views on that.
Yeah, and you know, in my early history studies, I dealt a lot with antebellum historians and Civil War historians, but I really appreciate when I started talking to Reconstruction historians that they were able to show me, make some connections that I just had not seen before. And everyone that I've spoken to makes the case that had Lincoln lived, Reconstruction would still have occurred and Reconstruction still would have been defeated. I haven't talked to one yet that stated had Lincoln lived, we would enter this peaceful, biracial, egalitarian situation that we often hope for. And the undercurrent here is this belief in white supremacy. And the Reconstruction historians keep drawing us back and back to that. And again, if slavery was the only issue, then once the 13th Amendment is adopted, why does Reconstruction fail? Why do we have segregation? Why is there lynching? And why does King run into issues in Alabama and Chicago after World War II? And so the Reconstruction historians are very pessimistic that had Lincoln lived, that we would have seen great differences. And one of the examples they often use is Grant. Grant tries to follow Lincoln's program as president, and it doesn't work. It fails. And he's very frustrated at the end, and he mentioned this in his memoirs just a year before he dies. And if you look at that, he doesn't have a lot of hope for the country on these issues because of all the challenges that he faced as president and all the failures he saw during that time and after.
So, Michael, do you have any views on Lincoln and Reconstruction?
So to Tim's point, there's no question that white supremacy is intractable, right? I mean, it's a world phenomena. It's been around for a really long time. Reconstruction was not going to make it go away. And it seems to me that Lincoln brought kind of richness of personality, for lack of a better word, a kind of a full-throated embracing of everyone's humanity to the way he lived and the way he led that I can imagine might have made some significant difference. I mean, I think about Lincoln, you know, Alex brought up the kind of the imagery of healing at the end of the second inaugural, right? mean, this is the president whose sister-in-law has lost her husband. He's a Confederate officer. He dies in a battle. She comes to the White House to visit him, and the press goes crazy. And after a little bit of brouhaha, the president famously snips, "I don't remember asking you for advice about my social calendar, nor do I expect to," right? I mean, so on the one hand, you've got this kind of brilliance, the kind of rhetorical brilliance that he's known for. But more importantly, I think he recognizes that the fact that his sister-in-law is in mourning is actually more important than the political cost that he's going to pay for having her in the White House. Those kinds of acts, I think, differentiate him from lots of other leaders. I don't know enough about Grant to kind of draw a sharp distinction, but I would ask that question. And so I guess if you believe that an individual leader can truly make a difference, then I would be inclined to argue that Lincoln was the kind of person who could probably have made a difference. I can't chart out where that would have gone. I just say he brought a different sensibility to the work of trying to heal the nation than anybody else would have.
Well, with this, I have a very large question for you all. I mean, President Lincoln is one of the most written about historical figures. Alex, at your site, you guys have an entire tower of books written about Lincoln. So why should we care about President Lincoln? Why should we continue studying him today? Why should we even have this symposium about President Lincoln tomorrow? It's a very large question, but I'd be interested to hear everyone's views.
Well, I'll follow up on Michael's point, and I thought he hit the nail on the head there. There are certainly attributes of Lincoln that we should admire and try to emulate as president. And, as Alex said so well, when you look at the second inaugural address, that's just a remarkable document. I mean, here we have a situation where hundreds of thousands of Americans have been killed, and Lincoln talks about with malice towards none. And as historians have said, this is grace, this is mercy. He doesn't want to see persecution of the Confederate leaders. He wants to bring the nation back together. And so there's certainly a fascinating plan there that he emulates in that speech that could be used at the end of all conflicts in trying to bring two belligerent entities together for a peaceful solution and a peaceful future.
Michael, Alex?
Oh, Alex should get the last word on this, but so I'm going to jump in. I would say, somebody recently asked me why people should come visit Lincoln sites, and this kind of amazing human quality that I was alluding to before is one reason that I think Lincoln looms so large in the American imagination, and frankly in the global imagination. And that's, it's hard to overstate that. I think the fact that strangers met him and he met them where they were, right? I mean, he stops in, at the contraband camp, what we would call a refugee camp today, on his way back and forth to the White House, and he sings with people and he dances with people and he eats and drinks with people, African Americans who have walked out of slavery and come to Washington. He's going to hospitals and sitting with soldiers. This kind of ability to meet people where they are and also maintain this this kind of other interior life where he's working on these big questions, I think really does make him kind of an amazing person. So that I think is something that everybody responds to. And then you have the fact that he took on the most remarkable problem in American history, and obviously, to Tim's good point, doesn't solve it, but moves us forward collectively in a really significant way. Not by himself, not without a lot of other people's help, but he certainly galvanized and led that process. And to Alex's point, he makes it really clear in the second inaugural, right? The war is all about solving this problem or moving it kind of making serious change on this tenacious problem. And so, you add to that he did in fact save the Union, however imperfect. And we are all still here able to work at making it a more perfect Union now because of that work. So for me, those are three really compelling reasons why it's still worthwhile to think and talk about Abraham Lincoln. I could go on, but over to you, Alex.
I was gonna say, I wish I'd let you have the last word because that was beautiful. And but I think it's important to continue like deep inquiry about Lincoln and really examining his humanity, as we've talked about, and because if we don't do that, then he sort of ascends to that back shelf of just legendary martyr, and we don't question the decisions he made and consider the challenges he faced and think about all the people he had to listen to come up with the ideas that he did, right? And think about the times he admitted he was wrong and changed course because someone else had a better idea and he recognized that. And the places that we save that, these two of his homes and then this place where he actually sort of sought joy but met death, right? Like these places can sort of be the houses of these big ideas. And as we sort of continue to think about what we want in our current leaders and our future leaders, who we strive to be as just individual participants in this nation and in this government, but then, even higher up, who do we want to elect? Who do we want to represent us? And when we think about Lincoln, we can go back and look at the fact that while a lot of people have very nice things to say about him now, a lot of people had really ugly things to say about him during his own time, right? He was this incredibly polarizing figure. And so I think as we face tremendous polarization in our own times, we can also seek a little wisdom and a little comfort from Lincoln there too, and see that, he was facing, unprecedented division in the country. And yet 100 and almost 60 years later, we all think he did a pretty good job.
Well, that's great. Thank you all so much for that. We have lots of questions in the chat, so we'll get over to some of those. We have one question about his relationship with Grant, but I think I'll save that for our speakers tomorrow. Another question is, how was Lincoln viewed by leaders of the Confederacy in general? Do any of you guys have an idea on that? If no, we can save that question for tomorrow too and ask some of our speakers.
Yeah, Ken, I asked you, I actually worked at a grant site for 9 years. What's the grant question?
They would just like to know about Lincoln's relationship with General Grant. So if you want to touch on that, definitely feel free.
Yeah, let me just touch on it quickly. I think what's remarkable about Lincoln's relationship with Grant is that when he meets him in March of 1864, that's the very first time they've ever met. Never had a conversation, never had any discussion before that. And yet when the first time they meet, he gives him the highest rank in the US Army. And I think it shows that Grant was judged by Lincoln by his actions, and he knew that he had someone that not only could fight, but number two, he knew that Grant recognized that slavery was a cause, slavery had to be destroyed, and that politically they were eye to eye on this. And he turns over the whole military organization to him because of that incredible level of trust.
Thank you for that. Well, we talked about some of his speeches today, his second inaugural, his April 11th speech. Did he write his own speeches or were they written for him?
Well, he wrote his own speeches.
Oh, and he worked really hard at it, contrary to the legends about him dashing off the Gettysburg Address on the train up to Pennsylvania. In fact, William Slade, who was a free African-American who was his valet, told his daughter that Lincoln would actually practice his speeches with William Slade, and William Slade would criticize him and help him with diction and kind of turns of phrase, which there's only one source of that, but it's a fascinating account of the intimacy that existed between William Slade and Lincoln.
Yeah, I know in the Lincoln Douglas debates, when I started studying him, I was really particularly interested in trying to find out who his campaign manager was for that year. And as it turns out, it was him. He wrote his own speeches. He made his own plans. He would sometimes ride into town on a horse to give a speech. And the only person that really stayed close to him traveling the whole time was a reporter who wrote just a great article about his experiences traveling with Lincoln. Sometimes it was just the two of them in a train car riding to another site for him to give a speech.
In 1864, he delivered 3 addresses to 3 different regiments from Ohio. And, the famous one is his address to the 166th Ohio Regiment. And that's the one where he says, I happen to temporarily occupy this big white house. And, but what's interesting is, so he delivers these 3 speeches all within about a couple weeks of each other. And so he's got the same kind of like outline that he needs to give, but each speech is slightly different. And you can kind of trace his mood with like what else is going on at the time. So at the same time, he writes the blind memorandum because he doesn't think he's going to win re-election in 1864. And, he's also sort of navigating a whole bunch of other like politics in Washington. And so like one of the speeches is a little bit harsher and a little bit more like call to action-y. And then there's the middle speech, which is a little bit softer and a little bit more thinking about the future kind of in this poetic abstract sense. And then the third speech is even a little bit different. So you can sort of trace Lincoln's thoughts through these different speeches, which is really interesting.
Yeah, somebody suggested to me that we should, at President Lincoln's Cottage, we won't do this because it's very much outside of the way we do things. It would be good and interesting exhibit, perhaps in the right context, suggested that we take multiple versions of the second inaugural and actually just put them on the wall to show the kind of evolving thinking around a single speech. It's more of an English, college English project than it is a museum experience, but it's a really interesting idea because for a lot of these documents, there are versions that, still exist. So.
I think that'd be fascinating. I vote you do it. So going back to Reconstruction, we have one question here. Had Lincoln lived, would the former Confederate states have been readmitted to the Union too soon, thereby giving the unrepentant South control of Congress once again and making ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments unthinkable?
Yeah, that was from Craig. I thought that was a great question. Well, let me jump back to the 1600s because Winthrop Jordan's book, White Over Black, he does a great job studying the stage for the Civil War. And he shows in the late 1600s, that's when the colonial governments started the first time they started adopting laws that say slavery is defined by the color of your skin. Before then, it was either Christian or non-Christian. But the problem is if you get baptized, suddenly you're free. So the colonial governments say, we got to find out something else, and they choose color. So for generations before the Declaration of Independence, for generations before the Civil War, this has been taught based on those laws to protect slavery. And so Craig asked a great question. This is how I would respond. How did the 14th and 15th Amendments prevent segregation? How did the 14th and 15th Amendments prevent lynching? How did the 14th and 15th Amendments prevent everything up through after World War II, so the king didn't have anything to do? And I think the real fundamental question is how effective truly were they if we still had all these problems that led into everything that we saw in the 20th century?
So one other question here. We actually had a program on Frederick Douglass yesterday, hosted by my colleague Jen Dubina. And so the question is, what was Lincoln's relationship with Frederick Douglass like? Frederick Douglass seemed to welcome the war as necessary to abolish slavery, but did Lincoln?
Oh, I love talking about Lincoln and Douglass. So Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln met in the White House 3 times. And the first time was in 1863, and Douglass went to the White House with no appointment, and he just knocked on the door and joined the queue of people waiting to speak to President Lincoln. And when he got to speak with President Lincoln, Lincoln welcomed him in, shook his hand, and they had a conversation that I can only imagine was probably quite tense, actually, because Douglass was there to sort of express his urgency and his sort of outrage at how the African-American soldiers were being sort of mistreated and unfairly treated, both by the United States government, as they were getting inferior supplies and they weren't being paid equally as white soldiers, and then horrifically like massacred by Confederate soldiers who were not treating them as prisoners of war equal on the battlefield. And so Frederick Douglass comes away from this meeting and he writes a letter to George Stearns. And in this letter, he describes meeting Lincoln. And it's in this letter where he sort of recounts how Lincoln admits that he's moving slowly, but he has his reasons for doing it. Douglass comes away from this meeting not totally satisfied by what Lincoln's doing, right? Douglass wants to see immediate abolition of slavery. He wants to see equality. He wants to see African-American citizenship right away. And Lincoln kind of gives him the reasons why he's not going to do that right away. But then Douglass says, I am convinced of Lincoln's commitment to emancipation, which I think is really important, right? So even though they're not seeing eye to eye, even though Lincoln is moving more slowly than Douglass wants him to, he trusts Lincoln. And I think that that's really important. He believes that Lincoln is committed to ending slavery in this country. The second time that they meet, Lincoln actually invites Douglass to the White House. And this is in the summer of 1864, in the middle of those speeches to the Ohio regiments, in the middle of the blind memorandum, like all of that's happening. And Lincoln is actually seeking Douglass's counsel to figure out how can they encourage more African Americans trapped in slavery to flee, to find their way to freedom, to make their way to Union lines, because Lincoln is afraid about what will happen if and when he loses re-election, right? The Emancipation Proclamation is not enough. It'll get tossed out by the next president, he thinks. And then the third time that they meet is on the day of the second inauguration. And Douglass attends the inaugural address. He hears the speech. He goes to the White House for the reception. He is initially barred entry because whoever was manning the door didn't believe African Americans should be let in. But Lincoln hears of this. He goes and he welcomes Douglass in. He says, my friend Douglass. So he publicly sort of declares his welcome, shakes his hand in front of everyone again. And he asks him, what did you think of the speech? And Douglass says something like, I think it was a sacred effort. And then Michael, you might speak to this, but he was also invited to the soldiers' home and he had to decline the invitation. And it was something that Douglass regretted for the rest of his life. So their relationship is fascinating. And I think another one that we can look to sort of get some inspiration for how we might work together with people who, sometimes we agree with, maybe sometimes we have differences with, but there's some shared goals.
Yeah, I think you've done a fabulous job of painting the picture of the complexity of the relationship, and they certainly saw each other as allies in the effort to end slavery, even if they disagreed sometimes about what the best mechanisms were. I put in the chat John White's book, A House Built by Slaves, has a whole chapter about this. It's a little drier than Alex's recounting, but it's a really, really good book and a really great chapter.
Great.
Yeah, the
So
only thing, Alex did a great job. The only thing I would add, if you look at Douglass's comments on the presidents, you tend to find that his comments about Grant are more praiseworthy for him as president of all the presidents that Douglass knew, because of the stances Grant tried to make and hold during the period of Reconstruction.
So we have one last question that I absolutely love. So I think it's a great one to end on. The question is that all of your sites are places where Lincoln rested or found a home. With so much turmoil around him, how did Lincoln find these moments to rest and get away? Or at least how do your sites interpret how he did that?
I'll start, since the other two people are more intelligent, I give them the last word. But in two ways, we always talk about Lincoln here relaxing. First of all, with his children, he's often known to play with them, even though 6 months of the year he's on the law circuit. When he was here, he spent a lot of time with them. We also know that, and that's the first and foremost. Secondly, of course, he had a dog named Fido, and he loved cats. There were cats all over the house. We don't know how many there were, but we have several references. He had a ton of cats in the house as well.
Sorry, before we finish answering this question, do you know, is the story of him saving a turtle true?
I haven't heard that one.
So it's like some boys were like treating a turtle badly, and they had it tossed over on its back and it couldn't turn over, and he like got them to stop, and he like turned the turtle back right.
Oh, that might be from the Indiana days.
Okay.
So, I'll declare myself innocent for that reason. So,
Yeah, I mean, at the cottage, we look at lots of different things. I mean, obviously, his relationship with Tad is a significant piece of it. Being able to walk the grounds and enjoy this beautiful rural landscape, reading poetry and Shakespeare to friends. You know, we know that he and the Lincoln family and their visitors sang ballads together in the drawing room. So you really do get a sense of this very robust kind of rich family life, and we do know that he spent a lot of time by himself, which was something that he did his entire life, right? And that seems to have been a really important source of respite for him as well. So at President Lincoln's cottage, he walked the grounds, he rode the grounds sometimes on his horse, but he also walked in the National Cemetery that's adjacent to the cottage. And we know that he sometimes read poetry out loud in the cemetery as well. So we try to paint a really rich picture of Lincoln the person, and that includes finding ways to recharge.
And the theater. He loved the theater. He said he loved to be alone and yet with people. And you know, the quote that sort of fills our hearts at Ford's Theater is Lincoln saying, you know, some think I do wrong to go to the opera and the theater, but it rests me. A hearty laugh relieves me, and I am better able after it to bear my cross.
Well, that is a great way to end this. Thank you so much to Tim, Alex, and Michael. We really appreciate you guys spending some time with us tonight.